LLMs still kind of suck at.
How's the landscape changing for your own API?
There hasn't been this like sea change effect from our customer base. Like, oh my God, Opslevel, please start adding more agentic action.
Were they ever surprised that they had to integrate with?
One customer I think about in particular, has been a customer of us for years, but our champion there is like, he hates, like he really hates.
If someone is launching an API today and you had to give them like one or two top things to look for, what would you advise them on?
If you're going to be efficient, if you're going to be successful, you gotta.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Request and Response. I'm your host, Sagar Batchu, co-founder, CEO of Speakeasy. I'm joined today with Ken Rose, CTO and co-founder of Opslevel. Ken, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you. Thanks for having me on the show.
Absolutely. Cool. To kick things off, I would love for you to share a little bit more about Opslevel and what you guys do.
Yeah, definitely. So at Opslevel, we make a product called an internal developer portal. And really, this is a tool that helps engineering teams manage the complexity of really large software environments. And we help consolidate a bunch of the context from various tools that sort of exist out there across the building of software, the deployment of software, the management of software in production into a single consolidated place so that engineering teams can ship more reliably and more securely.
That's amazing. It honestly sounds like a product I know a lot of our customers would be interested in. I've worked at a few companies where building out like this single pane of glass is such a tough thing to do at scale. So it sounds like you're solving a real problem. How did you come to working on this problem? What's your journey to Opslevel?
Yeah, it actually begins, oh man, like more than 12 years ago now. My co-founder, John, was the first employee at PagerDuty, right? The kind of big incident management company. And I was considering being their first Canadian employee. I'm based here in Toronto. And at the time, again, this is 12 years ago now, it was like, actually, I want to go start a startup. I really wanted to start my own company and do my own thing. And I tried something in like real estate and it didn't really go anywhere. And then I was like, went back with my tail between my legs. Yeah, John, is that job offer still there? I thought, go back to PagerDuty, work for a year, and then try again. Well, that 1 year turned to 4, and John and I became really good friends. And yeah, like that seed was always there. And so I ended up going to another company after PagerDuty. It's a small e-commerce company here in Canada called Shopify. And then I actually was on a parental leave. My daughter was born at the time, and I had that space to think about, like, what do I want in life? What's next? And that entrepreneurship bug was still there. And so John also had a similar kind of fire brewing in his belly, and he reached out and we started getting to talking. We had seen this idea of cataloging your services, building internal tooling to help development teams move more efficiently. We'd seen that problem being solved internally as an internal tool at just a variety of organizations. We talked to Spotify before they'd open source Backstage. Shopify had their own version. LinkedIn, Microsoft, Groupon, like all these companies had basically reinvented the wheel solving the same problem. And the thing we also love was the persona is other developers. It's other folks that were like John and myself. It's developers, it's platform engineering leaders, it's engineering leadership at large. That's my jam. I love those folks, right? That's the area I live in, the amount of empathy I have for that, the set of problems that those groups have is huge. So that was it was a very natural pull. And I'm really fortunate years later, our company's still thriving, growing, adding on new customers, and just really lucky to be able to found lightning in a bottle and being able to build this great product for all of our customers.
That's amazing. I can resonate with so much of that story, to be honest, that platform engineering is something I nerd out on so much. It honestly is that core part of many tech businesses today that is a silent hero in the background, giving the rest of the company velocity and the ability to create amazing products. The internal API and just more overall problem that Opslevel is solving is not too far from actually why we started Speakeasy and wanting to go after and bring consistency and governance and really just sanity to API development. I honestly feel like Opslevel would be something I could have used at any of the past companies I worked at. So that's really amazing. Does Opslevel have an API, or how do APIs fit into the Opslevel story today?
Yeah, no, we have a large API. In fact, we are very much like an API driven company. If you think about what goes into an internal developer portal, there's an aspect of a software catalog. There is aspects of standardization. There's aspects of developer self-service. There's a ton of automation that has to go into driving each of those pillars. And the only way to achieve that automation is through an API. So pretty much everything we build as part of our platform strategy, we need to be API first because we really want to be able to solve a large percentage of our customers' problems, as a product. But there's always going to be some long tail that we won't be able to solve directly, right? Our scrappy team of prod dev folks. And so for that, we need our APIs to be allowing for extensibility, allowing for customization so that our customers can self-serve themselves. So if there's some tool we don't support, if there is some particular workflow that like makes sense maybe for one customer, but not for our base at large, we want to make sure that our APIs are present and there to be able to do that. So that means that pretty much everything, and it's a very broad product suite that you can do through the UI, there has to be an API for as well.
Oh, that's fantastic. Going back to, it's really cool that you worked at Shopify during, I think, such an amazing time there. One thing that stands out to me as an API developer, Shopify always got a lot of attention for being a company that actually used the GraphQL API externally with their customers. And I thought it was really cool to see that hot new technology actually go to scale, be used publicly. I feel like since then, maybe this is a hot take, but since then, kind of the popularity on GraphQL, especially for external use cases, has gone up and down. And there's been a lot of debate around whether, REST or GraphQL is the ultimate option. I know there's no true answer, but I'm curious if that ever came up at Shopify. Did your customers, were they ever surprised that they had to integrate with GraphQL?
I don't think anyone was surprised because, there's kind of enough lead up to the fact, like, look, there was already this one API that was sort of using GraphQL. There was a lot of support. Shopify had maintained backwards compatibility with their existing REST APIs for, some period of time. So there was an overlap period to allow for that transition. Yeah. So, I think overall it was like for Shopify a net positive, but it wasn't without a lot of the usual hiccups that people kind of encounter when they're dealing with GraphQL, right? Both as a client and as a company that provides it. On our side, I can tell you as Opslevel running a GraphQL API, all the usual things, making sure that like, have N+1 queries, ensuring, you don't get per resource rate limiting like you do with REST. You have to kind of be more intentional about things like query complexity. Those are, challenges you have to end up having to solve. Versioning is another big one. We are far enough along in our journey. We haven't done a major version bump yet. I know a few years ago, this was after I left Shopify, they switched their GraphQL schema to be versioned, and now they have much more kind of program management around like I think it's every 6 months, they have a new major version bump. They require clients to migrate to the latest version. But that's effort and that's calories that you have to spend in that kind of API program management.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that's really where the argument kind of goes astray. A lot of the times, I think, is people, compare GraphQL to REST and then immediately look at how they're used externally, but they don't realize like how the practices that go behind running these two different kinds of APIs is vastly different. And I think you raised a really great point, like commerce is a graph, and that shows like kind of your choice on GraphQL was rooted in a use case that made sense. And I think it always reminds us as developers, like not to debate these things in the abstract. That is kind of a key use case behind why you might choose GraphQL. And I think Shopify just happened to be one of the first ones at scale and with a very, very clear use case for it.
Yeah, it's funny. I agree with everything you just said. And nevertheless, we have, some customers, we deal with developers, right? And sometimes developers are prickly is maybe a way I would describe it. So I know there's one customer I think about in particular. I love them. They're a fantastic customer. They've been a customer of us for years. But our champion there is he hates GraphQL. Like he really hates it. And the first time he told me that, I actually thought he was like, joking or being sarcastic. No, he was legitimate and serious because from his perspective, like he has a certain workflow he's trying to accomplish. Like, guys, I just need a list of services. Why can't I just like REST? You make a REST call and like, fetch/services and that's it. Why do I have to do all this stuff and build up a query and pass in this particular parameter? And I get that frustration for developers that, REST is sort of easier to start. It's easier just to create a curl request and be done with it, right? It's easier to pipe the output of a REST call, which is generally just a nice JSON blob into whatever you want versus no, you actually have to define the schema and things change. I think GraphQL solves a certain set of problems, again, around overfetching and if you have a variety of different clients. But for, there is this attractive part of REST, which is I just made a single API call, a single endpoint to get the one thing I needed, and that was it. And if your use case is that, the complexity of GraphQL can really be overwhelming.
Totally, yeah. There's like an inherent simplicity in just exposing your API one resource per, business object or business use case that you want your customers to take advantage of. Yeah, I totally resonate with that. Just on that API point again, what were some of the metrics you all looked at when you were running these APIs at scale at Shopify or even now at Opslevel? What metrics to you do you think that an API team should measure?
Yeah, I mean, I probably would be more apt to talk about what we do at Opslevel because that's just a lot more recent. I don't know what Shopify looks at. There's two classes, right? There's kind of just the operational metrics, like things like the red metrics, right? Request, errors, duration. Just understand like how is your API performing. For us, it's looking at specific, queries that are coming in and just understand like which ones are, potentially non-performant or what are some areas we have to fix. We have things like, N+1 detection to make sure that like we don't, explode. The other kind of like qualitative one has been feature requests that we get around missing capability in our API. Like I did just finish saying earlier, part of our platform strategy is this sort of Pareto principle. Like we want to make sure that for problems that are in the box, like something that 80% of our customer base wants, that's something we should solve as a first class thing. We obviously will have an API for it, but we always want to make sure those APIs exist because if we don't solve for something, there's an API to do it. That said, sometimes there are things that we will intentionally not have an API for. There's sometimes that's due to performance, or sometimes just that's due to the UX is really meant to be more human centered. It's not really meant for like a machine to want to ingest data or push data to do something with. But we do look at if we're getting requests for that, how does that translate to the fidelity then of what we're wanting to do with the API? It becomes sort of that backstop to justify, yes, this decision that we made to not put this in the API, maybe that was wrong, or maybe our assumptions about like why we did that weren't actually correct because now we're getting some input that like, oh, here's some use case, but they do want to use the API for this particular thing.
I love that framing because I see a lot of times with companies, they kind of expose a very large API, but then most of the traffic will be on like two endpoints, so one endpoint. And so they don't really have an understanding of which parts of the API are actually getting used. And so they've actually exposed a huge part of the API and created a massive dependency for their customers. And they move a lot slower as a result because they have to update, 100 endpoints instead of just two, which is like
Yep.
where all the value is. So I love the kind of framing on metrics that you guys have. If, I'm curious, if someone is launching an API today and you had to give them like one or two top things to look for, what would you advise them on? This is something I see. It's so funny. I see this on LinkedIn all the time where there's like API product managers talking about this. They'll be like the top 2 or 3 metrics that an API team should look at. I don't know if you have a point of view on that.
Oh man. I mean, I think it depends a lot on the business and like the scale that API is going to be hitting. Like
Mm.
I could talk about things in general, like again, think about like your red metrics, think about versioning of your API and how you're going to manage deprecations. It's almost, I like the term API product managers, like put on your product management hat.
Mm.
What is the value this API is providing? Why are your users using it? What are they trying to do? What problem are they trying to solve? And how does your API help them accomplish that? Then just focus on that repeatedly and make it, refine it until it's as simple as it can possibly be. I think that would be like the ultimate lesson. Everything else after that is just details in the pursuit of that goal.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think in some ways, API platform teams sometimes have to wear that product manager hat for the API, especially at the larger companies you have. Each team ships a part of the API and gets packaged up as like a single library or a single documentation site. Unless you have that API platform team owning those metrics and wearing the product manager hat, you often don't get that thinking. So
Yeah.
yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
There is actually one, now that you mentioned the API platform team, I do think consistency is an important thing, especially when you are dealing, if you have a large company of disparate parts of the company working on different parts of the API. You don't want to have, is it Conway's Law? You can kind of, you see the shipping of the orchestra. You don't want Conway's Law to
Yeah.
appear in your API. So making sure that API platform team or someone is providing guidance on like, here's how our organization thinks about the shape of APIs. Here's how you should think about structuring requests. Here's how you should name parameters. Here's what response format should look like. Here's consistent context to return and responses. Here's how to do a pagination. But it just ensuring that consistency, because the most frustrating thing as an API client is, okay, I hit this REST, hit this one endpoint, it works this way. I hit this other endpoint. Why is this structured differently? Like, why does this feel different? Yeah, that can be tremendously difficult. So just, having some guardrails or mechanisms to ensure consistency across an API surface area, also really valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm so glad you brought up Conway's Law. It's like the number one thing that I think I see when I look at like an API that's old, like a legacy spec. And since we deal with specs, I look through the specs and I think I can literally draw out the org structure by looking at
Right.
that schema document and being like, hey, these two are designed by one team. These two are designed by another team. And this one was tacked on later, right? Like
Right.
there's such a clear history of evolution built into it. No, I love that analogy. Switching gears a little bit, I mean, I don't know if you've been following things, but this week I feel agentic AI workflows for APIs just really hit its stride. Anthropic's MCP release, which has been out for a while, is kind of this protocol around how an AI, an agent can access an API really, kind of took off on social the last 2 weeks. I'm curious, what's your take on all of this? Like, how are you seeing, maybe starting with your customers and, your ecosystem, like are people asking for different tools? How's the landscape changing for your own API?
Yeah, there hasn't been this like sea change effect from our customer base. Oh my God, Opslevel, please start adding more agentic action. We're definitely seeing like drips and drabs. I think there's more from like the platform providers like Anthropic. Funnily enough, my big thing this last week on social was like there was something called agents.json that I saw, which seems to solve a similar challenge, so that describing an API to an LLM is still squishy. And if you just describe the endpoints, the LLMs will hallucinate or make up particular workflows, which might not actually make semantic sense. Something I think a lot about is just there's two things around LLMs, right? One of them is I think you're going to see more people being able to access APIs that previously couldn't. Like even now when we talk about APIs, okay, we're all a bunch of geeky nerds writing curl commands or using Postman or whatever it is, right? Or writing SDK code. But it's like, no, APIs are going to become more accessible to, I think, a larger audience because it's wrapped behind a natural language query with an LLM sitting in between it. But then that becomes really hard because LLMs still kind of suck at figuring out the shape of APIs and what APIs to call and what chain to do with them. So some of the things that you were describing with Anthropic or agents.json, being able to have some layer that can better describe to an LLM, hey, here's what you can do that will be deterministic, because that's kind of the heart of what a sequence of APIs should support, is going to be some necessary step for this technology to sort of be useful, right? I can tell you from personal experience in trying to use LLMs to help my own code writing go faster. I'll get endpoints that don't exist. I'll get chains of API calls that just don't make sense or don't compose well together. So there's still, I think, a gap in terms of that kind of semantic understanding that LLMs have of the shape of APIs. And, and at scale, that becomes really hard when you get really, really large APIs. And I think, by the way, the net effect of all this is that so more people using APIs, kind of larger market, that's going to mean that there's going to be, I think, a higher prevalence on like performance and efficiency of APIs. I remember maybe I'm dating myself with this, like 20 years ago, like website operators, like screaming at Google, like, why aren't you satisfying, robots.txt? Like you're scraping my page too often. I think you might see a similar thing with API providers, dealing with LLMs that are now hitting their APIs way more just because now there's just, larger numbers of users trying to get access to data.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think I've kind of observed I've had a similar experience. This week I've been spinning up MCP servers for any API I can get my hand on. And when it's these like simple, clean APIs, it does really well. I can interact with them to Claude or to Cursor AI and everything kind of just works. It feels magical. I was doing it with an email provider and they had just a very simple API, just send an email.
Send email. Yeah.
Send email. And it works. And it's really cool, type out that email in these clients and then see it just go off. But then I had a point at our own admin API, which, we're an API company. We like to think we design APIs reasonably well. And it did okay, but it wasn't like at the point where I could be like, hey, I can kill our retool dashboard because this is just way better. It's not quite there, and I agree with you. I think there is like a semantic understanding that's missing. We have this theory that's because that's the biggest gap, like the real winner in the space is going to figure out how to do evals and like the optimization problem around schemas. I think what makes like a good API schema for your docs doesn't necessarily make a good API schema for an agent or LLM to go use. So there's definitely a gap there. So yeah, I think very much see it the same way as you. I think what's interesting to me as well is that in that space, there's not just APIs I should say agents and tools for the common APIs that we all know about, but there's also ones for the internal APIs, the kind of hidden APIs that have always been hard to work with for companies, right? You go into a big company, and I feel like this is part of the value prop of Opslevel, is gives me amazing visibility into my own landscape of APIs as a big company. And I'm actually really excited for agentic tools to really like have an impact there, because that's really where the like discoverability, visibility problem exists. I think, working with a public email API or your Notion or GitHub is cool, but those APIs are already like really well documented and there's a lot of tools around them. So it's like adding an extra 5% productivity, but in the internal landscape, I feel like we'll be able to double productivity if we figure out how to make these things work.
Oh, 100%. Again, I started the show talking about a bit about like Opslevel, like we solve this problem of complexity. One of the aspects of that complexity is that you have this fragmented ecosystem of APIs kind of across the board. Some of our customers take very intentional API first strategies where there is an effort around ensuring that those internal APIs aren't just some artifact of like operations or some artifact of, we're creating a bunch of microservices and they all need to talk to each other, so we're going to have APIs. It's like, no. We're actually going to ensure there's proper documentation. We're going to ensure that documentation is consolidated. We're going to make that documentation easy to discover for developers, so that part of that complexity of, if I'm a developer writing some feature, needing to know which API, who do I talk to get more information about it? What are the request response parameters? What happens if something doesn't go right? How do I debug that? But that's all sort of in a single place. And then, to your point, now if you can like superpower that discovery with LLMs to have them generate a lot of that boilerplate for you, but correctly with this massive surface area of internal APIs that exist, I don't even know if it's a doubling. I think it's like 5 or 10x improvement in terms of what organizations can actually achieve.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the framing of helping you with boilerplate makes sense to me because I think these machines do extraordinarily well when you frame the work they have to do around a tight schema of some kind, whether it's like an open API schema or it's a service definition or it's even just like a YAML or configuration for another product that you're interfacing with. If you have them work around that, then there's like a sense of determinism and correctness that is easily measured and optimized for. So yeah, I totally agree. If anything, it's the acceleration of being able to deal with a fragmented landscape. If I have to go look up like 5 different YAML configs for 5 different products, but the LM can do that a lot faster for me, then I've, just massively increased my productivity.
Not just
Yeah.
look it up, even know where to look or that it
Oh my
even
God.
exists
Yeah.
out there, right? I can give you another kind of example here. Some of our customers have grown through consolidation. So
Mhm.
think about a payments service. They don't have one,
Yeah.
they might have four. So if I'm a developer and I've been told like, we're going to do something, we're going to hit the payment service. Well, which one? Which is the anointed
Mm.
one? Which one should I use for this particular use case? Again, having all that context centralized and having it be accessible to an LM, it just streamlines that entire activity and just makes it go that much faster.
Totally. I can imagine that's really useful even in legacy API situations. Like big companies have APIs that do the same thing, but they're like migrating from V1 to V2. And yeah, that as a developer, you probably have no idea where to look to get this
Yeah,
information. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. And just bring that into the IDE and into kind of an inline experience is so powerful. Just to wrap things up, I wanted to ask you too, you've been working with APIs for a while and now at Opslevel, you're so close to kind of key developer experience problems. What does great developer experience mean or look to you? Are there like products that you look up to or experiences that have shaped for you what a great DevX is?
Yeah. Okay. So I think of DevX similar to like UX, right? It's like
Hmm.
reducing roadblocks to accomplishing a goal. That's how I think about good user experience. And I think the same is true for developer experience, right? Ultimately, it's an exercise in reducing friction. So just let devs get to the happy place of shipping business value and all, across those 3 phases of kind of like whether they're building their software in that kind of inner loop of writing code, whether it's debugging software, whether it's shipping software, and having clear guidance also on what to do, on what is the way to write good code, whether because different organizations will bias for different things, but just making sure that's very clear, I think is an important part of developer experience. Organizations I look up to, it's sort of interesting because there's like internal developer experience. If I'm a developer at a large software company, and then there's the kind of external developer experience. If I'm a company providing a platform like, I don't know, Stripe or SendGrid for, an external developer audience to use. Stripe, I think, still is one of the gold standards in terms of that external developer experience. Just
Yeah.
phenomenal API documentation, phenomenal tooling, great support. I won't, shill Stripe too much here. For internal, again, I only kind of know from the experience I've had as a developer in prior organizations that I worked at. Shopify was really good. Like they put on a huge focus on onboarding. They had this really cool hypervisor system before Docker was a thing called Dev. And it made it really simple just to spin up a dev local environment like in your first day. Like your first day, get the monolith spun up, get, all the databases, all the dependencies, and get to shipping your first pull request like within your
That's
first
amazing.
24 hours, right? And that kind of investment in onboarding, similarly, investments in documentation, investments in tooling. There was a big emphasis in not even lack of toil, but like joy, like being joyful as a developer, kind of doing the day in and day out work. That's been, yeah, I mean, also gigantic public company, way more resources, but that's been something we've tried to emulate at a smaller scale at Opslevel internally.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. I have a phrase I like to use with my team is onboard day one, ship on day two. And I
Yeah.
think, that sounds like the kind of DevX that you were talking about.
Yeah. And again, I can relate that to, before they're customers, when they're still pilots, some of the people that come talk to us, they're in a different world, right? It might be like because there's fragmentation in production, because there isn't really any great unified dev local setup, it can be like weeks or sometimes a month for a new developer on a team to have all the context they need and get their very first kind of change pushed to production. And as I think about shift left and I think about incremental delivery and I think about business moving faster, you got to shrink that time if you're going to be efficient, if you're going to be successful.
Yeah, with all of these LMs coming about, I feel like the thing that's going to become the gating factor is actually human time and like real developer time because things will get so productive in terms of the workflows we have. Any point of friction will become the slowest, will quickly
Yep,
stand out as like the slowest point in a workflow.
definitely. I fully
Yeah.
agree.
On that note, Ken, come to this end of this awesome chat. Thanks so much for joining us today. If our listeners want to get in touch with you or stay up to date with what you're working on, is there a place that they should go look?
Absolutely. I'm on LinkedIn a lot, so I generally post about, there's two streams I'll post about. There's like ops level stuff, like feature launches, product launches, and there's kind of like random musings like this about, hey, here's something I've been thinking about APIs or LLMs or anything else that's hot. So find me on LinkedIn.
Got it. Ken, thanks again for joining us so much. And yeah, hope to have you here again soon.
Awesome. Thanks again, Sagar.